The first thing she heard was her own name spoken as though it were already a memory. Lady Elowen stood in the shadowed corridor outside the Duke's private study, the candle in her hand trembling ever so slightly as the heavy oak door remained cracked open by no more than an inch. She had not meant to eavesdrop. She had only come in search of the Duke to speak about the troubling rumors circling the estate. But when she heard his voice, cold, precise, calculating, she froze. "By morning," he said, "she will be replaced. Papers will be signed before dawn. No scandal, no noise. She will simply vanish from her position." The men inside chuckled softly, the sound of crystal glasses clinking together like a verdict being sealed. Elowen felt the world tilt beneath her silk slippers. Replaced by morning, after years of loyalty, of diplomacy, of carefully preserving his reputation and strengthening his alliances. She pressed her palm against the cool stone wall to steady herself, her pulse roaring in her ears louder than the Duke's voice. She leaned closer, her breath shallow, and listened as her husband, the Duke of Raventon, outlined a scheme so ruthless it seemed born of pure ambition. He planned to marry again under the guise of securing a stronger political alliance, claiming Elowen had proven too independent and unpredictable to be trusted with the duchy's future. He would accuse her of impropriety, circulate whispers through the court, and ensure she was quietly escorted away before sunrise. It was all arranged, servants bribed, documents forged, witnesses prepared. By the time the sun rose over the eastern hills, she would be a footnote in his story. Elowen did not cry. She did not burst into the room or confront him in fury. Instead, something far more dangerous settled into her chest: clarity. She slipped away from the corridor as silently as a ghost, her mind already racing. For years she had watched him maneuver through court politics, smiling at rivals while planting seeds of their ruin. She had learned from him, absorbed his tactics, understood the weaknesses of those who underestimated her. The Duke believed her gentle, decorative, too devoted to question his authority. He had forgotten that it was Elowen who had negotiated the grain treaties during the winter famine, Elowen who had written the letters that secured military reinforcements when neighboring lords threatened rebellion. He had enjoyed the credit while she remained in the background, content to let him shine. But now he had made the fatal mistake of assuming she would remain silent. While he erased her existence, she returned to her chambers and summoned her most trusted ally, Mrs. Harrow, the elderly housekeeper who had served the estate longer than the Duke himself. When Mrs. Harrow arrived, her lined face tightened at the sight of Elowen's expression. "He means to replace me by morning," Elowen said calmly, her voice steady as steel. The housekeeper did not gasp or protest. She simply nodded once, as though she had expected this moment. "Then we must move faster than he does, Your Grace," Mrs. Harrow replied. And so the night became a battlefield fought not with swords, but with secrets. Elowen knew the Duke's greatest vulnerability: his finances. Though the estate appeared prosperous, much of its wealth rested on fragile loans and carefully hidden debts. She alone possessed the ledgers revealing his reckless investments in foreign ventures. If exposed, his reputation would crumble overnight. But revealing them carelessly would destroy the estate and everyone who depended upon it. She needed precision. She instructed Mrs. Harrow to quietly wake Thomas, the stable master whose brother worked as a clerk in the royal treasury. She penned letters in her elegant script, one to the Crown's legal advisor detailing irregularities in estate accounts, another to a rival lord who had long suspected the Duke's duplicity. She sealed each with her personal crest. If the Duke intended to remove her by dawn, she would ensure dawn brought inspectors, inquiries and scrutiny he could not evade. As the hours slipped by, Elowen moved through the sleeping manor like a strategist positioning pieces on a chessboard. She visited the servants' quarters, speaking softly but firmly, reminding them who had advocated for their wages during harsh winters, who had paid for their children's schooling from her private allowance. Loyalty, she knew, was not commanded, it was earned. By midnight, whispers had begun to spread, not the kind the Duke had orchestrated, but ones of quiet solidarity. By 1 in the morning, Thomas had ridden through the gates carrying her letters toward the capital. By 2, Mrs. Harrow had replaced the forged dismissal documents in the Duke's desk with copies that bore subtle discrepancies, enough to raise suspicion should authorities examine them. Meanwhile, inside his study, the Duke drank to his impending freedom, unaware that the ground beneath him was shifting. He believed the night belonged to him. He believed Elowen slept peacefully, ignorant of her fate. That arrogance would become his undoing. At 3 in the morning, a knock thundered at the manor gates. not the discreet knock of a conspirator, but the authoritative pound of royal messengers. The Duke's smile faltered as servants rushed to answer. Elowen stood at her balcony overlooking the courtyard, the first hints of dawn painting the sky in pale gold. She watched as officials dismounted their horses, bearing sealed orders for an immediate review of the estate's accounts and governance. The Duke emerged moments later, his robe hastily tied, his expression tight with forced composure. He looked up and saw her standing there, calm, poised, radiant in the early light. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. She met his gaze without fear. He had planned to replace her by morning. Instead, morning had come bearing questions he could not silence. As officials entered his study and began examining documents, the Duke realized the trap had sprung, not around her, but around him. The whispers he intended to unleash now circled back upon his own name. And as Elowen descended the staircase to greet the royal inspectors, with dignified grace, she understood that survival was not enough. She would not merely remain in her position, she would redefine it. The sun rose fully over Raventon, casting long shadows across the courtyard, and in that golden light, the balance of power shifted forever. If this chapter has drawn you into the intrigue of Raventon and stirred your curiosity about what happens next, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because stories like this, where courage rises in the face of betrayal, deserve to be followed to their final, unforgettable conclusion. By midday, the manor that once echoed with the Duke's commanding presence now hummed with controlled chaos. Royal auditors moved from room to room, ledgers stacked high in the grand hall, their quills scratching relentlessly as they uncovered layer upon layer of concealed transactions. The Duke attempted to maintain authority, but the crisp certainty in his voice had dissolved into strained politeness. Elowen observed everything with deliberate restraint. She did not gloat. She did not confront him publicly. Instead, she positioned herself as the steady hand guiding the estate through unexpected complications. The inspectors quickly noted her meticulous records, separate books she had maintained for charitable funds, agricultural production, and tenant agreements. Compared to the Duke's tangled accounts, her documentation shone with clarity and honesty. It did not take long for the officials to begin, directing their questions not to him, but to her. The Duke realized too late that his attempt to brand her unfit would collapse under scrutiny. When one inspector produced evidence of unauthorized transfers to offshore accounts, the Duke's composure cracked. He accused clerks of incompetence, advisors of betrayal, but each defense unraveled as swiftly as it was spoken. By evening, a formal notice was issued. Pending investigation, the Duke's financial authority over the estate was suspended. Management would temporarily transfer to a regent deemed trustworthy by the crown. All eyes turned to Elowen. She felt the weight of that moment, not as triumph, but as responsibility. Accepting control would mean stepping into open conflict with her husband, yet declining would leave the estate vulnerable. She stepped forward, her voice calm yet resolute, and agreed to oversee operations until the inquiry concluded. Gasps rippled through the assembled staff. The Duke stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, not as a decorative duchess, but as a formidable equal. "You orchestrated this," he whispered when they were briefly alone. "No," she replied softly. "You did the moment you mistook me for powerless." Over the following days, revelations surfaced that extended beyond financial recklessness. Correspondence revealed the Duke had promised marriage to another noblewoman in exchange for political backing. His scheme to replace Elowen had been part of a broader ambition to consolidate influence at any cost. The scandal reached the capital within hours. Invitations to elite gatherings were rescinded. Allies distanced themselves. The same men who had toasted his plan now denied involvement. Reputation, once cracked, shattered swiftly. Yet Elowen's focus remained fixed on the people of Raventon. She convened meetings with tenant farmers, reassured merchants, and stabilized wages for servants whose livelihoods hung in the balance. Where the Duke had ruled through intimidation, she governed through transparency. Word of her leadership spread beyond the estate, transforming her from a sidelined duchess into a symbol of resilience. The crown, recognizing both her competence and the political advantage of supporting her, moved decisively. The Duke was summoned to the capital to answer charges of fraud and conspiracy. Until the inquiry's resolution, he was stripped of administrative power. On the morning he departed, the courtyard felt strangely quiet. The same gates through which royal messengers had arrived now open to escort him away. He paused before mounting his carriage, glancing back at the manor that had once reflected his dominance. Elowen stood at the top of the steps, dignified and unwavering. There was no hatred in her expression, only a solemn acknowledgement that choices carry consequences. He had intended to erase her by dawn. Instead, dawn had illuminated his own undoing. Weeks later, the crown issued its final decree. The duke's titles would remain in name, but operational control of Raventon would permanently transfer to Duchess Elowen, whose stewardship had preserved the estate during crisis. It was an unprecedented decision, one whispered about across noble circles. Some called it scandalous, others called it revolutionary. Elowen simply called it necessary. As seasons changed and the estate flourished under her guidance, she often reflected on that night outside the study door. Had she chosen confrontation over strategy, anger over intelligence, the outcome might have been very different. Instead, she had listened, learned, and acted with precision. Her story became a quiet legend, not of revenge, but of reclaiming power with grace. And so, standing once more on the terrace overlooking the rolling hills of Raventon, she watched the sunrise not as a threatened wife, but as a leader who had earned her place. If Elowen's journey inspired you, if her courage, in the face of betrayal, reminds you that strength often lies in patience and wisdom, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because here we bring you powerful stories of resilience, justice, and unforgettable turning points. And trust me, the next story will be just as compelling.